Today I'm going to demonstrate how to draw different types of animals using a structuring method we learned earlier this year. You may remember speaking about an order of operations that goes skeleton, map, angles, details. And if you've ever seen one of those how to draw books, you will notice that many of the artists who explain how to draw things use the same method. I like to draw this way because it helps me to plan where I'm going to fit different images within a composition. I used to start with details and spend a lot of time working on a specific part of a drawing before I realized that I was going to run out of room to fit everything else that I wanted to include on the page. But I found that using this structuring method helps me to make sure that I'm going to be able to fit everything I want to include within a space and make adjustments before I invest all of that time into working out the details. In order to practice this skill, I'm going to use a large sheet of paper that I will fill with 8 very different animal figures. Since I'm drawing animal figures, I'm going to use photographs from the wildlife fact file that show the entire body of the animal, not just the face. That would be a portrait. Also, I want to choose a variety of animals so that I can practice drawing different body types. I'm not going to choose animals that are all different types of cats or different types of bears. I want to mix it up a bit and choose animals that have opposite defining characteristics, like a giraffe and a chimpanzee, a rabbit, an alligator. They all have very different body types and are therefore going to help me to round out my drawing skills. I'm going to use 4 different colors to create each of my animals. The reason I am doing this is to make sure that I am following through with using each step of the structure method. I'll probably switch my colors as I'm drawing to make it more fun and interesting, but I'm going to try to use the lightest colors first when I draw the skeleton and map out the big basic shapes, and then switch to using medium colors when taking angle measurements, and finally my darkest color for the end when I'm drawing details on the surface of the animal. This way, my initial structure lines will not stick out as much beneath the completed animal figure. I'm going to start with the image of a giraffe. The first thing that I want to do is draw the animal's skeletal structure. And I'm not talking about the bones and the vertebrae. I'm simply referring to an armature-like structure that I will use to build the rest of the body around. I'm going to use the angle measuring technique that we learned and take measurements through the center of each of the big basic shapes that form the animal's body. I will start with the spine and use a very light color, like yellow. I want to be able to see it, but I don't want the skeletal structure to stick out when I'm done. I noticed that there's a change in that line where the back and the neck meet, so I want to make sure that I'm taking 2 separate angle measurements for that area. I'm going to make sure first, before I start taking the measurements, that my picture planes are aligned, because my measurements aren't going to make sense if I'm trying to translate lines from a photo that is tilted one way to a paper that is tilted another way. Remember, the sides of both planes need to be parallel to one another so that the technique will work. I'm also going to close one eye to get rid of my binocular vision. This will make the angle measurements a little bit easier to see. I'm lining up the edge of my pencil with the line that I'm trying to capture. This one's going right through the center of the back, right up the animal's neck. So in order to keep that angle so that I get accurate information from the photo to my drawing, I'm going to lock up my wrist and my elbow so that I'm not allowing that angle to falter or move in any way, and then I'm going to drop it right down to my paper. I'm going to do this for each part of the giraffe. I want to imagine that there are invisible lines cutting through the center of each of the body parts. I will take the angle measurement for each of those lines to figure out how those parts are oriented. Like, if I'm trying to figure out how the head is tilted, I want to imagine that line cutting right through the center of the face. I'm going to do this again for each of the legs. I noticed that the upper part of the leg is tilted at a different angle than the lower part of the leg. So like the spine, I'm going to have to take 2 separate measurements. I'm going to divide each of these segments from one another with a small circle that indicates the joint at the knee. Now I'm going to switch the color that I'm using. I think I'd like to use a light orange color that is just a bit darker than the yellow lines I started with. I'm going to move on and start mapping out the big basic shapes that I'm seeing. Here's where I want to make adjustments and figure out if the sizes of each individual part relate well to the entire animal. When we talk about size relationships, we are talking about proportions. So I'm going to take the edge of my pencil and measure the proportion of the giraffe's head against the length of the neck. I see that I'm able to fit at least 3 head spaces into the length of the neck. So I'm going to make sure that the sizes of the shapes in my drawing reflect that information. You want to think about the different shapes that are making up different parts of the body. I think the giraffe's head looks like an upside-down triangle. The neck looks like a long rectangle that tapers toward the head, and the body is kind of a lopsided Hershey kiss shape. The legs are long, skinny rectangles. Once I have the body shapes mapped out, I'm going to use the angle measuring technique once again, this time to form the outline of the body rather than the skeleton. I'm going to switch my color to a slightly darker orange so that these lines stand out over my initial lines. When I take measurements for the outside of the body, I'm going to have to take note of all the places where my outline changes and take a new measurement there to reflect the angle at which the line is oriented. This step is going to help me check my accuracy so I know that I have correct information for the shape of my animal. Once I'm sure that all of my lines appear accurate, I will draw the details. This part of the process reminds me of that activity we did earlier this year, where we flipped an image upside down and tried to trick our brains into not thinking about it analytically with our left side, but allowing our intuitive right brain to take over so that we could draw what we were actually seeing rather than what we assumed to be true about an image. Because I now have a map to follow, I could stop thinking about what it is I'm attempting to draw and just let my pencil flow as my eyes follow all of the curves and details that I'm actually seeing. I'm going to switch to purple for this part of the drawing. Not only will it stand out from the colors I used for the structure, but purple and yellow are complementary colors, and I feel like purple is close to brown in some ways, so it just seems appropriate for the giraffe. I'm going to finish this and move on to the next animal. I'm choosing to draw a rabbit because its body is very different from that of the giraffe. I think I'm going to use different shades of pink for this drawing because when I was young I had a white rabbit with pink eyes. I will use the lightest shade of pink to draw the skeletal structure of the rabbit, starting with the spine. I will use a medium shade of pink to map out the big basic shapes of the rabbit, dark pink for the angles forming the rabbit's outline, and red for the fur and details. I want to make sure that I'm leaving enough room for 6 additional animals so that I'm able to fit all 8 of them on the page.